Picture two people, same intelligence, same work ethic, same values. One of them is financially stable. The other is stuck, no matter how hard they try. And here's the uncomfortable question most people never ask. What if the difference has almost nothing to do with intelligence, effort, or character? What if it's something happening inside the brain itself? Something that switches on under specific conditions. And once it switches on, it doesn't matter how smart you are. That sounds hard to believe. We're taught that financial success comes down to decisions. Work harder, save more, make better choices. And on the surface, that sounds true. But researchers who've spent years studying this have found something that completely upends that story. Poverty doesn't just limit what you can afford. It changes how your brain actually functions in real time in a measurable way. And understanding this isn't just interesting trivia. It's the key to understanding why so many genuinely capable, intelligent people stay stuck, no matter how many just work harder articles they read. So in this video, we're going to break down exactly what happens inside the brain under financial scarcity, the specific research behind it, and why this explains far more about the poverty trap than laziness, bad decisions, or lack of intelligence ever could. My name is Jack, and I spend way too much time thinking about the psychology behind money. If this topic matters to you, make sure to hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Let's get into it. Let's start with an experiment that changed how researchers think about this entire topic. Princeton psychologist Eldar Shofar and Harvard economist Sendel Muloinathan ran a series of studies looking at how financial stress affects cognitive performance. In one striking study, they went to a New Jersey mall and gave people scenarios. Imagine your car needs a repair. It'll cost either $150 or $1,500. Now take this cognitive test. For people with higher incomes, it didn't matter which number they were given. Their test scores stayed the same either way. But for lower income participants, something remarkable happened. When the number was small, $150, their scores were normal. But when the number was large, $1,500, their cognitive performance dropped significantly. Not slightly, significantly. The researchers found the effect was roughly equivalent to losing an entire night of sleep or dropping around 13 IQ points. 13 IQ points. Just from thinking about a hypothetical expense. Now here's the part that matters most. This wasn't about intelligence. These weren't less capable people. The same individuals, when the financial stakes were low, performed identically to the higher income group. The moment the financial stakes became threatening, their available mental capacity dropped temporarily but measurably. This is the core finding that explains almost everything else in this video. Financial scarcity doesn't just limit your bank account. It consumes cognitive bandwidth. And once you understand that, a huge number of confusing, seemingly irrational behaviors around money suddenly make complete sense. So let's talk about what cognitive bandwidth actually means, because this term gets used loosely, but the research behind it is very specific. Think of your brain's capacity for conscious thought, planning, and decision-making like a fixed amount of mental bandwidth available at any given moment. Under normal conditions, this bandwidth gets distributed across everything you're thinking about: work, relationships, long-term goals, daily decisions. But scarcity, whether it's scarcity of money, time, or even food, has a very specific effect on this bandwidth. It doesn't just add one more thing to think about. It captures attention involuntarily. Shofar and Muloinathan describe this as a kind of tunneling effect. When you're dealing with genuine scarcity, your brain automatically narrows focus onto the scarce resource, because from an evolutionary standpoint, that focus used to be life-saving. If you're starving, your brain should absolutely prioritize thinking about food over almost anything else. That's not a bug. That's exactly how the system is supposed to work. The problem is that modern financial scarcity triggers the exact same mechanism, except the threat isn't a single, solvable emergency. It's a constant, ongoing condition. Rent, bills, an unexpected expense, a tight month that never seems to end. And because the tunneling response evolved to handle short-term, acute threats, not chronic, ongoing ones, it doesn't know when to turn off. So the brain keeps tunneling constantly, which means a portion of available cognitive bandwidth is permanently allocated to managing the scarcity itself, leaving less available for everything else. Planning, long-term thinking, complex decision-making, the exact mental resources you'd need to actually improve your financial situation. This is what researchers call the scarcity trap, and it's genuinely one of the most important concepts in modern behavioral economics. Now here's where this gets even more specific, because tunneling doesn't just reduce general cognitive capacity. It actively distorts financial decision-making in predictable ways. First, tunneling makes you excellent at solving the immediate problem in front of you, and worse at almost everything outside that tunnel. If you're scarce on money, you'll often become remarkably resourceful at handling this week's crisis, stretching a grocery budget, finding a way to cover this month's rent. In some ways, people under financial scarcity can be sharper, more creative problem solvers than people who've never faced real financial pressure, specifically within the tunnel. But that same intense focus means anything outside the immediate emergency gets neglected. A car maintenance issue that isn't urgent yet, a subscription quietly draining money each month, long-term financial planning. None of that fits inside the tunnel, so it gets pushed out, even though ignoring it often makes the overall situation worse over time. Second, scarcity creates what researchers call a borrowing behavior, mentally and financially. When you're deep in a tunnel focused on solving today's problem, your brain heavily discounts the future cost of solving it. This is why someone under financial pressure might take a payday loan with brutal interest rates, not because they don't understand the math, but because their available cognitive bandwidth in that moment is almost entirely consumed by the immediate crisis. The future cost genuinely registers as less real, less present, less urgent than the problem directly in front of them. This isn't poor judgment in the way we typically think about it. It's a predictable consequence of tunneled attention under scarcity. Third, and this is the part that explains so much confusing behavior, tunneling depletes the exact mental resource needed for self-control and long-term planning. Researchers call this resource executive function, and it's the same cognitive system responsible for resisting impulses, planning ahead, and making decisions that require delayed gratification. When bandwidth is consumed by scarcity, executive function suffers, which means the very moment someone most needs strong self-control and careful planning to escape a difficult financial situation is also the exact moment their cognitive capacity for exercising that self-control is at its lowest. Read that again, because it's the single most important insight in this entire video. The scarcity trap isn't just financial, it's cognitive, and it hits hardest exactly when you can least afford for it to. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Jack, this sounds like an excuse. Are you saying poor people just can't help it? No, and this is really important to get right, because the research doesn't say that at all. What it says is that scarcity produces a measurable, temporary reduction in available cognitive bandwidth in anyone, regardless of underlying intelligence or character. The Princeton Mall study proved this directly. The exact same people performed at completely different cognitive levels depending on whether the financial stakes felt threatening or not. This isn't about who someone fundamentally is. It's about the conditions their brain is operating under in a given moment. Here's an analogy that makes this click for a lot of people. Imagine trying to have a focused, thoughtful conversation while someone is tapping you on the shoulder every 15 seconds. You're still just as smart, your IQ hasn't changed, but your performance on that conversation is going to suffer because a portion of your attention is constantly being pulled elsewhere. Financial scarcity functions like that shoulder tap, except it doesn't stop, and it's tapping specifically the part of your brain responsible for planning your way out. This reframes the entire poverty conversation. It's not that poor people make worse decisions because they're less capable. It's that scarcity itself creates the conditions under which anyone's decision-making temporarily degrades, and because financial scarcity tends to be chronic rather than occasional, that degradation becomes a persistent condition rather than a rare exception. So if this is a trap, and it clearly functions like one, what actually breaks it? The research here is genuinely encouraging, because if the problem is bandwidth, the solution isn't a try harder or be smarter. It's specifically reducing the number of ongoing decisions that consume scarce cognitive bandwidth. First, automate what you can. Every financial decision you have to actively make and remember consumes bandwidth. Automatic bill payments, automatic, even tiny, savings transfers, automatic bill reminders. Each one you automate removes a small tap on the shoulder, freeing up a sliver of mental capacity that would otherwise be spent tracking it. Second, reduce the number of financial decisions you're making in a depleted state. This is why Schaffer and Mullainathan's research points toward simplifying financial systems for people experiencing scarcity, rather than demanding more discipline from them. If a system requires fewer active decisions, it requires less bandwidth to maintain, which means it's far more likely to actually stick, especially during the exact moments when bandwidth is lowest. Third, build even a small buffer specifically to interrupt the tunneling response. Remember, tunneling gets triggered by genuine, immediate threat. Even a modest financial buffer, we're talking a few $100s, doesn't eliminate scarcity, but it can meaningfully reduce how often the tunnel gets triggered in the first place. Fewer triggers mean more available bandwidth, more often, for the long-term thinking that actually improves the underlying situation. Fourth, and this might be the most important one, recognize tunneling when it's happening. Simply knowing this mechanism exists changes how you respond to it. If you notice yourself making a decision purely to solve today's problem while ignoring an obvious future cost, that's not a character flaw showing up. That's tunneling in real time. And once you can name it, you can consciously pause and ask, is this decision being made by the tunnel or by my actual long-term judgment? That pause alone, even without solving the underlying scarcity, restores a small amount of control. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Denise. Denise wasn't lacking intelligence or work ethic. She was working 2 jobs, managing a household, and constantly making decisions under pressure. Every month felt like triage. She told me she used to think of herself as bad at planning ahead because she kept making decisions that made sense in the moment but backfired later. A payday loan here, a missed opportunity to negotiate a bill down there. Once she learned about tunneling, something shifted, not overnight but gradually. She started automating the few bills she could. She built a tiny $300 emergency cushion over several months by redirecting small amounts whenever possible. And critically, she started recognizing the tunnel when it showed up. She told me the biggest change wasn't the money, it was that she stopped blaming her own intelligence for decisions that were actually a predictable response to chronic scarcity. Once the underlying pressure eased even slightly, her decision-making noticeably improved. improved not because she suddenly became smarter, but because her brain finally had the bandwidth to think clearly again. So here's what I want you to take away from this. If you've ever felt like you should know better but keep making financial decisions that don't serve your long-term interests, this is likely why. Not a character flaw, not a lack of intelligence, a brain operating under chronic scarcity, doing exactly what scarcity-adapted brains are wired to do, tunnel toward the immediate threat at the cost of everything else. And if this explains someone else in your life, someone you've privately judged for financial decisions that seemed irrational, this research suggests something worth sitting with. Their brain, under those conditions, might be functioning exactly the way any brain would. The way out isn't more willpower. It's reducing the number of decisions scarcity forces you to make under depleted bandwidth, automating what you can, building even a small buffer, and learning to